morning, just barely. Good afternoon. As Alicia said, I'm Lauren Holloway, Director of Data Security Standards with the Council, responsible for all things PCI DSS.
Hi, and I'm John Bloomfield. I'm a manager of data security standards and work with Lauren.
So today's session is all about vulnerability management in the PCI DSS context. Vulnerabilities are security weaknesses in a common way that attackers gain access to your systems. New security holes or bugs are discovered daily, and attackers are quick to take advantage of them. In 2023, for instance, 25% of high-risk vulnerabilities were exploited on the same day they were disclosed, and another 50% were exploited within 19 days. Vulnerability scans help you identify and address these security weaknesses before attackers can exploit them. So we'll review and discuss the PCI DSS requirements for vulnerability management, including external ASV scans and internal vulnerability scans. And we'll also talk about a risk-based approach when it comes to remediating your internal vulnerabilities. So PCI DSS, as many of you are aware, includes requirements for external vulnerability scans. These are scans of your internet-facing IP addresses. They're performed at least once every 3 months. They're pass-fail, and they're performed by a PCI-approved scan vendor, or ASV. PCI DSS also has requirements for internal vulnerability scans. Your organization runs them if you have qualified staff or you hire a third party. You also run these at least once every 3 months. And whether your internal vulnerabilities are resolved or addressed is defined by your own internal processes. We're often asked if penetration testing is the same as a vulnerability scan, and the answer is no. Pen testing tries to exploit vulnerabilities that have been found. Sometimes penetration testing will find vulnerabilities, but that's not the goal of penetration testing, which is to try to break into systems and networks. So penetration testing complements, but does not replace scanning. I have a couple of slides on ASV scans, and then we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about internal vulnerability scanning. So ASV scans, sorry, things are moving on me here. So ASV scans are scans of your internet-facing IP addresses, as I said. These are your riskiest areas because they are internet accessible. You do them at least once every 3 months using a PCI-listed ASV, or a scan vendor. And as I said, the result is pass-fail. And at least once during that 3-month period, you need a passing result. And this means you have no medium and no high vulnerabilities. And these are CVSS-rated vulnerabilities. John will talk a little bit more about CVSS in a bit. These are CVSS-rated vulnerabilities between 4.0 and 10.0. If you don't pass the first time, you need to fix vulnerabilities and rescan until you do pass. Now, assessors will look for evidence of 4 passing scans at least once every 3 months for the year. We did publish an ASV resource guide in 2024. We've included the QR code here. It's a 2-pager, high-level explanation. So if you're interested, you can scan that code. We'd really like to encourage you to scan more often than once every 3 months. There are many benefits to doing this. It will help you lower your risks quicker and catch and fix your issues earlier within the period, which means that hackers are not able to exploit your vulnerabilities, or you cut down the window during which they can exploit your vulnerabilities. And multiple scans during a 3-month period will help you avoid the last-minute scramble for a passing result. Many entities schedule monthly or even weekly scans for their key assets, and this increases your chances of having at least 1 passing scan per that 3-month period. It's a simple way to help you keep your security posture steady.
OK, what I'm just going to talk about now is some of the internal vulnerability processes. So your processes, and this is to identify and risk rank those vulnerabilities, is really important. Because what it does, it allows you to understand and address your organization's unique risks. And really, that's what this whole risk-based approach in the title of this presentation is referring to. Just on the screen here, we've just got some really high-level steps here about you need to identify your vulnerabilities, you need to risk rank them for your environment, and then resolve or address them accordingly. And location and context here matters a lot. So what we have here, Lauren just gave it away with the slide there, but I'm going to talk about this by tires. So I want you to imagine a tire. You've got that tire, it's worn, it's potentially got a nail in it, but where it's located, that represents the context part. So bear with me here, but imagine that tire is on a truck and it's speeding towards a bend. Now, most of us would probably agree that represents a risk. It's going to increase the braking distances, that truck might lose control as it goes into the corner, and there's also that outside risk that that tire might burst. Now, what happens if you've got, that nail from the previous image? What happens if you've got one of those in a tire? Has the risk increased? Well, if that tire is on the bed of the truck, well, there is still a risk, but it's not the same. Other risks are coming into play. But that presence of that tire with the nail in on the back of the bed isn't increasing that initial risk. So what happens if that truck has got a third worn tire? Well, now, if that truck is in the garage, it's waiting to be repaired, there's no more risk of a blowout. There's no more risk of, going into that corner and losing control. And even about that spare worn tire on the back of the truck, that's not really coming into play either. Now, the point of this somewhat long analogy that I've just gone on to here is that the risk and impact of a vulnerability depends on really where that vulnerability is, what it can affect, and what threats it's being exposed to. So that same vulnerability can be riskier for certain systems and less riskier for others. And you shouldn't treat that same vulnerability equally across your environment. And in essence, that's what we're talking about here when we're talking about that risk-based approach to managing your internal vulnerabilities. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit later when we go on to some targeted risk analysis sections.
So there's two PCI DSS requirements that focus on identifying and risk ranking your vulnerabilities. We have the requirement 11.3.1, which is to run internal vulnerability scans to identify those vulnerabilities. And then we have requirement 6.3.1, which asks you to evaluate those scan results along with vulnerability information from other sources, maybe from your vendor or other places you get vulnerability information. And then you assign those vulnerabilities a risk ranking. At a minimum, you need to identify what is high risk and what is critical in your environment. You can use external risk rankings if you agree that they work for your organization. But if you don't agree that those risk rankings work for your organization, then you can assign your own risk ranking to those vulnerabilities based on asset criticality, threat information, business impact. Either way, at the end of this process, you have your vulnerabilities ranked. Now, we also have PCI DSS requirements that talk about addressing and resolving vulnerabilities. So you've identified your high-risk vulnerabilities and your critical vulnerabilities. We just talked about those. Now, for critical vulnerabilities, these are resolved by installing patches within 1 month of release. For high-risk vulnerabilities, these are also resolved by installing patches, but these are resolved by installing patches within the time frame that you identify based on your level of risk. The guidance for this requirement includes an example of within 60 days, but that's just an example. For all other risk rankings that are not high risk and they're not critical, you address those based on a targeted risk analysis. And this target risk analysis will include timeframes and your risk-based decisions about whether you're going to resolve or address these vulnerabilities. So to summarize that process at a high level, critical vulnerabilities, you're going to resolve them within 1 month of release. High-risk vulnerabilities, you're also resolving them, but within a time frame you determine. And all other vulnerabilities, they're not high risk, they're not critical. You address them via your target risk analysis. Now, you might be wondering, what's the difference between resolve and address? So resolve means you fix that vulnerability. Maybe you install a patch, you change a configuration, maybe you implement a compensating control, you make that vulnerability go away. An address means that either you're going to resolve it, or this is where your opportunity for a risk-based decision comes in. You may decide you're going to accept that vulnerability because it's a low risk for your organization. And this also would all be documented in your targeted risk analyses, that you're going to accept these vulnerabilities on these systems. So you track your decisions, and you need to review them annually for these risk-accepted items, because you want to make sure that the risk of that vulnerability hasn't changed within your environment.
Now, I saw quite a few people taking photographs of the slides that Lauren just had there. But don't worry, because we actually have all of that information as an infographic. Now, we did actually have some of these at our booth. Unfortunately, they've all gone. But you can go to our document library, and you can download that. And the reason why I want to say this, it's just a really useful tool. It helps people understand about vulnerabilities. So when you're onboarding people, you can help explain to the IT teams how they should do this, because it explains the flow about that, about the scanning, risk ranking, the resolution, and the verification of that. So go have a look at our document library. You can download a version of it there. But how do we make those risk rankings smarter? So when we talk about internal vulnerabilities, it's really important to separate the severity from risk. And I'm just going to go over some basic terms over this. So we've got the CVE, and this is the Common Vulnerability and Exposure. And what this does, it's a simple identifier that gives us a catalog entry to say, look, hey, here's a vulnerability. But on its own, it doesn't really tell us about how dangerous something is. So then we go on to what hopefully many of you are aware of about the CVSS, or the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. Now, this is the value that often gets churned out by those scanning tools. And what this does, it gives us that measure of severity, but what it does, it gives us that kind of ranking, whether it might be rated as critical or high. But it's a theoretical value, and it doesn't actually give you much information about whether it's being exploited currently. So this brings us on to the EPSS. Now, this is the Exploit Prediction Scoring System. And this model actually gives us a likelihood about a vulnerability being exploited in the real world. And it helps us move away from that theoretical severity to that kind of probability-based perspective. Then going on from this, we have the known exploited vulnerabilities, the KEV. And this is where we start bringing in that real evidence. And this is the vulnerabilities that are being actively exploited in the wild. And these are being tracked globally. So if it's on that KEV list, we know that attackers are using it, as I say, in the wild. And then the final part here is the risk. And this is where you can layer in your own kind of business context. This is where you start thinking about where that asset sits, whether it's internet-facing, for example, or it could even be buried deep in a segmented network. And it's when you start to get to truly understand the risk of that vulnerability. So that severity basically gives us a starting point, but that risk, to actually understand it for your organization, it requires that whole kind of technical information, the business information, and that threat-based information. And that is going to be how we're going to make those smarter, more defensible prioritization decisions on the vulnerabilities. So a vulnerability might not be the same across all your systems. And I go back to that car tire that I discussed at the very start. So this is where we really talk about context being key. So two signals I just want to bring out from that previous slide. We had that KEV, just to reinforce there. So that was what attackers are actively exploiting in the wild. And we had that EPSS that predicts what they're most likely to be attacking next. But the scanning and those two signals on their own, it's not really enough. To get a really holistic picture, you're going to need to combine them with other information. So you can be thinking about, for example, vendor advisories, cert alerts, even commercial feeds, potentially dark web monitoring. You've got the whole kind of SBOM data, and even bug bounty reports. And when you're bringing all of those different sources together and you're feeding them into your centralized risk ranking process, you're then transforming that massive long list of static vulnerabilities that have been generated into a real prioritized list that you can take action on. So what you're thinking about here is the threat intelligence and multiple data sources. They're turning that theory into action, and it's helping you fix those vulnerabilities. OK, now, I said I was going to touch on TRAs. So TRAs, you're going to need one of these to support your decisions about how you're resolving or addressing those all other vulnerabilities. So as inputs, you need to consider the rankings that have assigned to those vulnerabilities, which assets have those vulnerabilities, and how critical they are to your organization. You then move on to the analysis. So when you're looking at that, this is the risk according to those assets, where the asset is and how critical that vulnerability is for that specific asset. And then you go on to the output, and this is where you get that a ranked risk per asset, which vulnerabilities need to be resolved, and which assets and in which priority. Now, the key part here is the QRAs, the SAQ, sorry, getting all right there, the qualified security assessors, when they're going in there, they're really going to be wanting to see that TRA, and they're going to want to see the supporting documents as well. And this is all going to come into that requirement 12.3.1. And the really useful bit about the TRA, it becomes your audit trail when you're looking at it, because it then becomes your evidence. It gives you that defense for why you chose to do the patching in the order you do and why it was appropriate for your environment. So one thing I want to mention here about these authenticated internal scans. Now, this was new in in version 4. And so it's come fully into effect now in March 2025. And this is all internal scans now need to be authenticated, except, and I want to point this out, and I've had some questions at the booth about it, this is where the system cannot genuinely accept those credentials. But in those cases, you're going to have to document it. So let's have a quick look at the two differences here. So in a quick comparison, unauthenticated scans, now this is where there's no username or password that's going into those scans, and it's really what an external attacker might see without any kind of user credentials. On the flip side, when you're looking at those authenticated scans, this is where there's additional privileges, and you can see much deeper into the systems. So you can see the configurations, the default passwords, missing patches, and hidden exposures. And what's going to happen is that the authenticated scans are closing that gap that the unauthenticated scans often leave. Now, hopefully, most of you will have been going through those authenticated scans. Please be aware, when you're running them, they generate a lot more vulnerabilities. So please give yourself a lot more time to be resolving them.
So that's vulnerability management in a nutshell. Well, just to summarize a little bit, for ASV scans, again, you do them at least once every 3 months. But please do them more often, as we said, because it will make your life easier. These scans are pass-fail, with all vulnerabilities with CVSS scores above 3.9 must be resolved. And then you rescan, you fix the vulnerabilities, and you rescan until you have a clean scan, all within the same 3-month period. You work with a PCI ASV, and we have lists on our website. Hopefully you're all aware of that list. And you need at least one passing scan in that 3-month period. And for your internal scans, you should consider doing these more often as well. And remember using the multiple sources of vulnerability information that John talked about, and not only relying on scan results. So you're going to identify and risk rank those vulnerabilities. And once you agree with those risk rankings, you either resolve them via patching or you address them via your targeted risk analysis, which involves your risk-based decisioning, how you want to address those low-risk vulnerabilities. So hopefully this presentation helped you in a few ways. We wanted to clarify vulnerability management for PCI DSS. There's requirements in 6 and requirements in 11, and again, get kind of confusing when you're trying to compare them. We wanted to explain key differences between ASV scans and internal vulnerability scans, and we wanted to explain about this risk-based approach and how it can help you to resolve or address your internal vulnerabilities. It was also important to us to explain how TRAs, or targeted risk analyses, fit into your risk-based decisioning and can really help you make those decisions. So we'll be around for the rest of the conference. You can come find us if you have any questions.